love that song. Well, I like my name because even though there's a few Rexes around, there ain't many. And generally, I can count the Rexes in this town on not even have to use a whole hand. There just ain't many Rexes. And if you put my last name with that, Walcher, yeah, I'm pretty much one of a kind, which is kind of a good thing. But in the Bible, names get kind of confusing because a lot of people have the same names. And probably no more confusing than James. There's a lot of different James in the Bible. And I don't know if you know this or not, but we all kind of call them by certain things to distinguish them from one another. And so when we start talking about it, James, if I said James, you might think of the Gospel of James, which was written by the Lord's brother. Or maybe you would think of James, the son of Zebedee, which was one of the apostles. Or maybe you would think of James the Less, or James the son of Alphaeus. A lot of different James. So it gets a little bit confusing. And the first one that really we talk about was the apostle. We call him James the Great. If you ever see that, and that's kind of a Catholic thing, but that's James the Great. He's James the apostle, James the son of Zebedee. He's one of the sons of thunder that Jesus talks about, that the mother came to him and said, when you come into your kingdom, let one sit on your right and one sit on your left. And he basically said, you don't know what you're asking. And that was those guys. They were fishermen. They were part of the inner circle of Christ. They were those that were probably closest to Jesus. In Mark 3, it says, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. So he called them that. A lot of people say, well, why? Why did he call them that? Because they were loud, maybe boisterous. They're the ones that said, should we call down fire from heaven? Maybe that's why he called them that. But I guess they were kind of out there a little bit, right? But of course, John, we know, lived to an old age, died as an old age in Ephesus, lived to be almost 100 years old. And John wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation. But James was his brother, and James was really significant. And we ask, about James, and James, the significance of him. And he was in that inner circle, and Jesus included him in these things that were very important to him. When his days were approaching his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? So it was James and John who wanted to do that. Maybe that is why they were called the sons of thunder, but we really don't know that for sure, but that's a possibility of that. But these guys were significant. They were always mentioned. It was always Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And those guys were at the Transfiguration. They were at the raising of Jairus' daughter. They were at the agony in Gethsemane. They were the guys that Jesus was the closest to. He was the one that when he went to pray in the garden, he said, come and pray with me, a stone's throw away, while Jesus knelt down and prayed. He was the one that when Jairus' daughter was raised, he made everybody else sit outside, but he brought them with him. When he went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, those are the four that he took with him, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, that he took with him up to the Mount of Transfiguration. So James was a very important guy. James the Great, we call him. But the bad thing about James is that James, unbeknownst to him when Jesus called him, James would become the first Christian martyr. The first apostle to be martyred, not the first Christian martyr, that'd be Stephen, but he became the first apostle to be martyred. He was killed by Herod really early on, 44 AD. So shortly after Jesus' ascension, James was put to death by the sword by Herod, and he became the first apostle that we know of, the first apostle to be put to death. So that's kind of the first James that we talk about, and we call him James the Great. James the Great. But the other one is another apostle, right? The other apostle is James, the son of Alphaeus. Now that's pretty common in that time. That's how they would say who somebody was. We knew it was kind of like a way to identify. There weren't really last names, so that was a way that we did that. And the apostles were often categorized by that. We knew that it was Simon the Zealot, that was a zealot, zealous for God. He was a Roman zealot. We know it was Judas Iscariot, which we think that probably means where he was born, because he wasn't a Galilean. So there was different ways that we identified him. And of course, James, that we just talked about, James the Great being one of the apostles, if we have another apostle, we have to identify him. So he becomes James, the son of Alphaeus. And James, the son of Alphaeus, was probably the brother of Matthew, who was the tax collector that Jesus picked up from the tax collector booth. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. You know, one thing you see as you look at this, or I've always noticed, is that Jesus chose a lot of guys that were related, didn't he? I mean, you know, he chose Peter and Andrew, James and John, and in this case would have been Matthew and the other James, James the son of Alphaeus, both the son of Alphaeus, which is kind of interesting that he chose these brothers. And all these, of course, except for Judas, were Galileans. He said, "Follow me," and he got up and followed him, very much the same way that he called Matthew, or Levi, the tax collector. In Matthew 10:3, it says, "Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus." So James, the son of Alphaeus, is one of those apostles that kind of faded into history. We don't really know much about him beyond the Gospels, what he did, what he didn't do. We don't really have a lot of information about what he actually did, but we know that he was one of the apostles, and we identify him. So he becomes kind of our second James as we go through the James. The other one's kind of interesting. He's not really mentioned just once in the Bible, and he's called James the Less. And James the Less, and that word in the Greek, it either means he was small, like he was a short guy, like he was really the less, or he was young. It was one or the other. Could be either one, small or young. But we only see him mentioned one time in the Bible, and that's at the cross. It says there were some women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joses and Salome. So there's a lot of question about who this James really is. Is he a different James? Is he James the son of Alphaeus? There's a little bit of evidence that says maybe they're the same, but we don't really know for sure if they are or not, because James the son of Alphaeus was never referred to by Jesus, or in the Gospels, was never referred to as James the Less. So it seems like it's another identification. But then we look at the name of his mother. That doesn't help us much, does it? Because there's so many James in the Bible, there's more Marys, right? There's Marys everywhere. Mary is just a really common name in the Bible. We've got Mary, the mother of Jesus. We got Mary Magdalene. We got Mary, the mother of James the Less, that are all at the cross. So it gets kind of confusing. It's just such a common name that we don't really have a basis to say, oh, well, this is it. But what we did do is we look at a synoptic. We look at a parallel passage of this in John 19. It says, "Therefore the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister," and that's kind of interesting, isn't it? "Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene." So if this Mary, if you look back to this other passage here, it says Mary, the mother of James the Less. But in John, he says Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So we think this Mary, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary, the mother of James the Less, are the same Mary. And if that's true, then we can kind of make a little bit of a jump here. We can kind of make a little bit of a jump and said that Mary might have been the wife or daughter of Clopas. Assuming she was the wife, some go on to conclude from a superficial word resemblance that Clopas and Alphaeus are two forms of the same name. This in turn has led to a suggested identification of this James being the same as James the son of Alphaeus, but we don't really know that for sure. So we've got these James to start with, right? We got James the Great, which is James the Apostle, one of the inner circle. We have James the Less. We have James the son of Alphaeus. We have James the Less. So that leaves us with one more James in the Bible that's significant. And he is called James the Just. And James the Just is the brother of Jesus. Now, he's really interesting in the Bible because he didn't believe in Jesus until after the resurrection, but then he became a real leader in the church in Jerusalem. And if you look at the book of Acts, when Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem, they met with James. And this was the James, because you got to remember, James the Great, the apostle, he had already been martyred. He was martyred in 44 AD. So when we start talking the rest of the Bible, we talk about James. We're not talking about James the Great anymore, who's been martyred. Now we're talking about James the Just, which is a brother of Jesus. So James becomes this brother of Jesus Christ, and when Jesus is raised, he becomes significant in the Bible story. In 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul talks about Jesus appearing, he says Jesus appeared to James. So Jesus himself, in a resurrected form, appeared to his brother, which is really interesting. The brothers didn't believe, if you remember that, as most of the people in Nazareth didn't believe. And Jesus' brothers didn't believe that Jesus was really the Christ. But after the resurrection, when Jesus appeared to him, James not only believed that Jesus was the Christ, but James became a real leader in the church. And James gives us the Gospel of James. And that's where we get that. The brother of Jesus, he appears to come forth after the Lord's resurrection. And 1 Corinthians 15 states that Jesus appeared to him after the resurrection. James became an important leader of the early church. He was with Peter. Matter of fact, we call James an elder of the church in Jerusalem. And it's obvious that James had a really big role in that Jerusalem church, which means that he not only dealt with the other apostles, with Peter and the other apostles who we know were there, but he also dealt with Paul as Paul traveled through Jerusalem on his missionary journeys, and probably even with Paul as he came through Jerusalem on his last missionary journey where Paul was thrown into prison. James becomes really significant. James became an important leader. He was with Peter, and when Peter left Jerusalem after Herod's attempt to kill him in Acts 12, he became the principal leader in the Jerusalem church. What happened in Acts 12 is that Herod attempted to kill Peter, and because of that, Peter left Jerusalem. And when Peter left Jerusalem, that left a void in that church because Peter had left. And James apparently stepped into that role and became an elder of that church in Jerusalem and stepped into that role that Peter was kind of holding. And he became the principal leader that we know of, mentioned in the book of Acts. He was at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, which is where Peter and Paul and Barnabas came from Antioch down to Jerusalem to discuss the Gentile involvement in the church. And it was James that argued, or James that kind of put forth the idea of how to make that reconciliation, or how to make that compromise. So James was instrumental in Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, and it could be argued that Paul in Galatians 1:19 refers to him at least on the same level as an apostle. He authored the book of James, which chronologically was probably the first book, maybe not, maybe so, probably the first book in the New Testament, and he was martyred by the Sanhedrin of the Jewish court in 62 AD. So James stayed around for a little while, and that's James the Just. So when you read a James in the Bible, you kind of got to figure, which James am I talking about? You're either talking about James the Great, the Apostle James, who was part of the inner circle of the Lord. You're talking about James, the son of Alphaeus, who was also an apostle, who was one of those who traveled with Christ. You might be talking about James the Less, who would have been the one who was at the cross, mentioned at the cross with Jesus, who possibly could be James, son of Alphaeus. But probably, most of us, when we think about James in the Bible, we probably think about James the Just, James the Lord's brother, who is instrumental in the church in Jerusalem, who gave us the book of James, and who was involved in the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts. That's the James that we probably think about. But it's kind of an interesting little thought, and a lot of times people come to me and they get Jameses mixed up, because we can do that. But you know, the truth is that's kind of how this plays out. So which James? One of those guys, right? James the Great, James son of Alphaeus, James the Less, James the Just. And so that's how we kind of categorize these different James in the Bible. So thanks for your time this evening. If we can help you in any way,